love of money. Today we live in America where everything is so plentiful, so bountiful, we can get anything we want at the snap of a finger. It's very prevalent in today's society to be able to get what we want. We have tons of cars, tons of houses, we can get loans, we can get anything we really want anytime we need it. But is the love of money the root of all evil? We hear this phrase a lot in common societies. It's been used in movies and music. But where it stems from is actually from a New Testament verse, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10. And it says, "For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." So as I always do in all my videos, I always want to say that let's go back to the Torah, let's go back to the law and the prophets, and let's test and see if this is the truth or if there is an alluding truth to it. To do this, let's go back and look at Deuteronomy chapter 8. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 1, we see God telling us, it says, "All the commandments which I have commanded thee this day ye shall observe to do, that ye may live and multiply, and go in and possess the land which Jehovah sware unto your fathers. And thou shalt remember all the way which Jehovah hath led you these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble you, to prove you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you, and he suffered you to hunger, and fed thee with manna which you knew not. Neither did your fathers know, that he might make thee know that man doth not live by bread only, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of Jehovah doth man live." The principle here he is trying to make is that even though our Father provides everything for us physically, in food and shelter and clothing, he is also trying to make the allusion here that just as man needs food to live, he also needs his words to live by. And you'll also see this phrase. It's a commonly used phrase that you'll actually see in the Gospels, and it says, when Jesus was being tempted in the wilderness, Satan tempts him and says to make this stone a piece of bread, and he responds with this very verse in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. He responds and says, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God does man live." So while there's nothing wrong with having things that are nice in this world, like food, a nice house, a nice car, things like this that are available to us at our fingertips in this nation of America, we also have to remember that it's not just those things that we should live by. We also have to remember that God gave us his words so that we could use those words to live by those, equally just as important as the food that we put in our mouths and into our belly. So as we continue over and we get to verse 10 in Deuteronomy chapter 8, we can see the dangers of the lure of prosperity. If we start in verse 10, it says, "When you have eaten and you are full, you shall bless Jehovah your God for the good land that he has given you." But in verse 11, it gives us the warning. It says, "Beware lest you forget not Jehovah your God in not keeping his commandments and his judgments and statutes which I command thee this day. When you've eaten and you're full, and you build good houses and dwell therein, and when your herds and your flocks multiply," in these days you would say your cars and your houses multiply, "and your silver and your gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart will be lifted up, and you forget Jehovah your God, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage." So what we can see here from this passage is that we can end up forgetting Jehovah our God. And how do we do that? It says that we will forget him in not keeping his commandments, his statutes, and his judgments. When we become full, when we become prosperous, that is the biggest danger that can come to us, because then we not only become idolatrous in making money our God, but what it really does is it makes us forget God and realize that it is him who provides all these things for us. And this is why Moses is telling the people to make sure that when you have eaten and you are full, that you are always thankful for the things that Jehovah your God has given you, because he is the one that has power to give, and he has power to take those things away from you. And it says in verse 17, and it says, "And if you say in your heart, my power and the might of mine hand has gotten me all this wealth, you shall remember Jehovah your God. It is he that gives you power to get wealth, and it is he that gives you power to establish his covenant, which he sware unto your fathers, as it is this day. And it shall be, if you do at all forget Jehovah your God, and walk after other gods, and serve them, and worship them, I testify against you this day that you shall surely perish. Just as the nations which Jehovah destroys before your face, so shall you perish, because you would not be obedient unto the voice of Jehovah your God." So one more time, we can see that it's not the fact that the actual money is the root of all the evil. It's the fact that the money will actually cause you to forget Jehovah your God. And how do we forget him? We forget him by not keeping his commandments. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, we see the Song of Moses. This is one of the things that the song was actually speaking about. It says in verse 15, "But Jeshurun," which is an interpretation for meaning the people of Israel, "But Jeshurun waxed fat and kicked, and is waxen fat. You're grown thick, and you're covered with fatness. Then he forsook God, which made him, and lightly esteemed the rock of his salvation." And this verse right here is actually an allusion to one of the parables that even in the New Testament made, that you should build your house upon a rock. And if you're building your house upon the Father, who is the rock, then it won't fall. But if you have forgotten God as your rock, and you've lightly esteemed the God of your salvation, and you stopped keeping his commandments, then in the day of calamity, and you built your house on sand, it will fall. Another parable that is actually used to give this interpretation is the parable of the rich young ruler. What we see here is in Luke chapter 18. A ruler comes up to Jesus and he asks him, "Good servant, what good thing shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And he responds with, "You know the commandments, keep the commandments." And he says, "Which ones?" And so he lists the commandments: do not commit adultery, do not kill, do not steal, do not bear false witness against your neighbor, and honor your father and your mother. And his response is very quick with, I've kept all these since my youth up. What do I lack? And Jesus responds, one thing you lack. Go and sell all that you have and give unto the poor and come and follow me. And of course we know the story that he would not give up his belongings and he went away sorrowful. But what is the allusion here being made? If you notice the commandments that he actually mentioned, none of them had to do with the Father. If you look at the two tables of the covenant, what you're going to see is all the commandments on the right-hand side, commandments 5 through 10, that he mentioned, have to do with loving your neighbor as yourself. The first 4 have to do with loving Jehovah your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. The commandment is, I am Jehovah your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make unto you any graven image, the likeness of anything male or female, or anything in heaven and earth. Shall not bow down to them nor serve them, for Jehovah your God is a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the 3rd and 4th generation of those that hate me, but showing loving kindness to those that love me, unto 1,000 generations. And then of course we see, you shall not take my name in vain, which is vastly interpreted today, but in short it just means to make sure that we are bringing glory to his name properly due to our actions, and not profaning it by worshiping other gods, by stealing, by doing things that would bring a bad name and a bad report to the name that we carry. And then of course to keep the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a very actual proof that we are his children, that we have chosen Jehovah as our God, and this is a perpetual covenant for all generations. If we are not keeping this Sabbath, then we cannot claim Jehovah as our God. Now one of the things that we see here is that Jesus makes a claim and he says, follow me. And what we don't see, because this book has been taken out of the canon today, is many references to the book of the Maccabees were made in the Gospels. And one of the things that Judas Maccabee said in the book of the Maccabees was he followed the people, he called the people up, and he said, all those that are faithful to God's covenant, follow me. So every time you actually see Jesus actually saying this phrase, follow me, what he is actually alluding to is this same comment from the book of the Maccabees. And what we see here is Peter actually makes a comment and he says, who then can be saved? And then Jesus responds, with men this is impossible, because God is not a man, of course, but with God all things are possible. And what he is alluding to is another statement from the book of the Maccabees, which says, let us pray unto God that we will be able to keep his law and get help from him to do his law. And the last thing you actually see from this parable is that Peter rises up and he says, we have forsaken all and followed thee. And he makes the comment and he says, there has not been man or woman who has not left all that he has behind it will not gain 100-fold more in this time, nor in the present future, 100-fold more. This is an allusion, of course, of what happened in the book of the Maccabees. When the Jews were actually being persecuted in that time for keeping the covenant, they went out and fled into the wilderness, leaving behind all that they had so that they could become faithful to that covenant. And this is what he's referring to. When the time comes at Hanukkah, will we leave all we have behind and go back to the land of Israel to get away from the persecution? Or will we deny our Father and worship another God? And in this case, it would be Jesus. And this is what this day is coming to. I'll make this in another video, but in that day, you will either have to deny Jesus as your God because he is not God, or in those days, the people were referred to as traitorous Jews because they didn't keep the law anymore. This is the allusion to Judas. The allusion is always that we are taught in the Torah to keep the commandments and live. We look at Proverbs chapter 4, verse 4, and he says, he taught me also, and he said unto me, let thine heart retain my words, keep my commandments and live. And then in Proverbs 7:2 again, keep my commandments and live, and keep my laws the apple of your eye. And the last thing I'll actually close with is this. Commonly people will actually use a phrase that Jesus says, and that is, what shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? What he is referring to is Proverbs chapter 19, verse 16, which says, he that keeps the commandment keeps his own soul, but he that despises his ways shall die. So once again, my message is always clear. We want to use the Torah, we want to use the law to check and see and use that as our measuring reed to see if all these principles and all these statutes that are being taught measure up to what God has said previously in his instructions of his law. And what we find here is that the New Testament is using an allusion to say that riches will lead to many evils, and one of those is idolatry. So yes, look at Deuteronomy chapter 8 and use this principle to see that when we do receive the lure of prosperity, we should not forget God in forgetting his commandments and not doing them anymore. But we should actually make sure that when we do get a lot of prosperity and we do get blessings that come with keeping the covenant, that we should always stop and reflect and thank Jehovah our God for everything that he's given us. That way we're always mindful. I hope this video was a help to you today, and maybe you've learned something new that you hadn't seen before, and I'll see you again in another video. Thank you.
Let there be light. Let there be